Welcome, everybody. I am Dr. Dream, and this is the It's All Good show. Happy New Year to you as we launch into 2025. How incredibly exciting. And no matter what 2024 was for you, let's just energize all your dreams coming true and all the excitement and love and joy that you wish to allow into your life manifesting for 2025. This is a fun show because it is the first show of the year, but also my guest today is since I restarted the podcast, it's been super nice for me because a number of my guests are friends of mine from the past and also people that have been on a podcast I had years ago. And so today's guest kind of fits all of that. His name is Joshua Wenner, and he's been a friend of mine since 2006. His brother Jeffrey introduced the two of us. Had a strong feeling that it was important for us to meet, and he was absolutely right. In 2009, July 1st, 2009, Joshua joined me on Awaken the Dream Radio, a podcast I had, and we did a show called Forgiveness, a Practical Technique. Now, Joshua has gone through a lot in his life, and I commend him because he has been able to share the lessons that he has learned in the process that he has gone through with so many people to help make their lives better also. And he's been very transparent about everything that's happened. And just a little over a week ago, his film, called Gift of Grief, came out, and we're going to talk about that and what he's doing and some of the processes that he takes people through. And I'm just super excited to welcome you and the new year all in one fell swoop. Joshua, thanks so much for being with me today.
Hey, it's such a pleasure, Dr. Dream. It's so nice to reconnect and be here with you today.
Fabulous. Now, before we get into just everything, I like to give my guests a chance to kind of introduce themselves and give us the touch points that are important to make sense of where you've come from and how you got to where you are now.
Yes, if I was given just bullet point, kind of high level, big picture, I was more in the peak performance space and was more of a speaker trainer with Tony Robbins. And actually, I was before that because we're in the consciousness conversation. I had a sacred geometry company, is how I'd say I first entered the personal development space. And then around that time, my brother Jeffrey came to ask me for help. He'd gotten into heroin, and on Christmas said, "Hey man, I need your help. I got to come live with you or I'm going to die." I had that startup company running and told him no. And 2 days later, he went back to Reno and died of an overdose. That was really the start of my hero's journey into where I'm at today. But it led me through first going to work with Tony Robbins, going like, all right, I'm going to learn the best tools around mindset to overcome this. Thought I healed my grief after going, working with Tony for a couple of years, and kept feeling a deep calling to help people around grief and trauma, and jumped on some grief forums of like, I got all the tools to help you fix your grief, failed miserably, and realized maybe I don't know what I'm doing here. And started to research grief and trauma, started to interview different experts, realized I was the one that needed to heal my grief and trauma, which led me on another journey of learning somatics, tools around grief and trauma, put myself back together again, and then started to help men. So I've been helping men for over a decade, do a lot of hands-on deep somatic work where we reframe grief and trauma as a place of power and courage to overcome life, and then use somatic tools to get in and feel and offload past grief and trauma that may be stopping us from getting the results that we want in our life or keeping us more emotionally stuck. That led to doing men's rites of passage, which I did for the last 5 years and put through over 1,000 men in doing rites of passage. And then I also started helping fire and police. So I have a company where I train fire, police, and military on tools to come home to their families from all the trauma they take on their jobs. And most recently, I'm now doing women's work, which is really exciting. I did men's work for a decade. I've worked with women for about the last 5 years. And a lot of my healing around relationship has come from women. And so I used to believe men do men, women do women. And all of my deep healing more recently has come from women around women. And so I'm like, it's a nice little parallel now that I know men so well. A lot of women are looking to find that ultimate relationship or learn how to understand men a little bit deeper. So I can provide a really good space of learning the same fundamental tools around grief and trauma, but to heal the relationship with their hearts. Because I find often in relationships, the conflicts and the challenges that we have are often our past grief and then our nervous systems, which are trying to keep us safe or keep us in survival. And that's what most of the conflicts in our relationships are, or we have with finding unhealthy partners. And so I'm really grateful to be doing that work now.
Fabulous. Everything that you're doing and impressive and inspiring. Take us into the energetics around your healing of everything around your brother's death and kind of that process for you.
Yeah, it's a long journey. I feel like I'm actually just the last 2 years actually coming out of some of the deep grief coma that I was in that I wasn't aware of, even though I did a lot of work and got a lot better. I had a more, actually, it's in the film. There's a forgiveness moment in the film where some of the men from the community I created an event and they did a forgiveness process. And I think I just felt so safe. And I'd been teaching forgiveness for over a decade. And so I was very familiar with it, but I reached a new level. I think the new levels of somatics that I'd gotten to in my body allowed me to access a different level of forgiveness where I'd blame myself for my brother's death that I didn't know. And so just the last 2 years, my brother died in 2007. To give context, and I'll go a little bit deeper into the parts, but I feel like the last 2 years, I'm like, oh, I don't need to save the world anymore. Like I realized unconsciously I was trying to save the world to make up for where I couldn't save my brother. And I'd had an unconscious belief that it was my fault, trying to make up for it. And so everything's shifting now of finding where I'm now is about healing myself and living a great life for myself and also helping other people live it. But I'd say a lot of there's kind of different stages when I feel like we're first in the grief, you're just trying to get through the day. So if anybody's listening that, is coming out of a holiday season or I've recently had somebody die, it can be really painful. I find some of the ones that are more confusing is there's so much loss baked into life, right? We get older and we're grieving who we were when we were younger. We have visions of like, oh, I want this type of life, and then life ends up this way. All the way back to childhood where we dreamed of having our parents take care of us and they got divorced, or somebody died, or we felt abandoned, or we thought men were safe and there's a violation, or we thought my friends are going to take care of me and then we feel shamed or humiliated. And so there's all these little levels of loss that stack up within the body. And those get stuck in the center column, which is this area right here. And so initially, when I was in my grief, I was trying to think my way through grief and trying to understand it, but I was really disconnected from my body. And so what was really helpful is getting into what they call somatics, which is more body based, where you learn to go into the body and do different practices using sound, movement, or breath to start to move and get into the body. And that starts to kind of bring you more alive and more connected to your body. And then through those practices, the body knows what to do. The body's brilliant. Body's a part of God, part of nature, part of source. We just got to get out of the way from our heads to let us get into our hearts and our body. And then the body starts to take us on this healing journey. So a lot of my healing journey was learning how to move out of my head or trying to fix it and like seeking external validation or things into the future and learning to get really regulated with my nervous system, which we can talk a little bit about today, of how do I get regulated so I'm not in a habitual survival pattern trying to survive, which we learned in childhood, but I'm learning to use the front of my brain, which is like my prefrontal cortex, which is compassion, empathy, rational thinking, and it allows me to be present But the challenge with that is if I start to become present, there's all this past grief or past trauma or heartbreak that I may not have dealt with. And so that's where the somatics are helpful. So if I can get regulated, I can now start to see and go, oh, what's going on with me? Then I can start to use some different somatic tools to actually move that through the body. And when we do, it's I use a similar metaphor. It's like changing the oil in your vehicle, right? Imagine if we're vehicles and you're driving on red line, we're going to have to fill up the gas, which is emotional regulation, if we want to keep driving towards a mission or a journey. And we're going to have to change the oil to keep that engine running smooth, which would be an example of somatic type practices to transmute some of the heavy, dark gunk that we get stuck in and put in that nice golden oil, which allows us to the system to run smoother. So that was a lot of my journey is compressed in a couple of minutes, which took me 15 years of moving through that journey of head back into the body, and then deep forgiveness work of forgiving self combined with somatics is really what brought me back. The only other thing I would add is community. We have a tendency to isolate often as humans when we're in pain because we don't want the world to see us in pain or we're going through deep grief or something's coming up. And so we often isolate. And what's really needed is community. We need to be witnessed in our grief, witnessed in our pain. And oftentimes that witnessing allows us to feel connected, to feel back to the whole, which is what they used to do in tribes. And so we've just lost a lot of those practices. So community, somatics, forgiveness, and nervous system are kind of those key fundamentals.
Let me ask you something. Does the grief ever truly go away, or is it just integrated differently? I mean, how does that work? My brother passed away in 2020 at 39 years old, slipped into a diabetic coma. No one was there to identify what was going on. And I've done a lot of work around it. There's a lot of grief for me around it. And maybe I need to come do one of your sessions, but it seems like I come more into alignment with it, but yeah, does it go away?
I'd say my perspective on it is it the grief doesn't really necessarily go away. I believe that and one of my mentors taught me this. He introduced this concept of like the broken and the whole. And oftentimes we're resistant to feeling broken. Most of personal development is like, we're whole, we're whole. And so I know, at least for me, I was like, oh, I'm not broken. I want to be whole. But it was in the acceptance, as long as we're in a dualistic world, if there's whole, there's broken. And broken is really the heartbreak. And so what helped me break down the metaphor is when we love somebody or something, it could even be a dream very deeply or a person, and there's deep love there, and that's taken from us. That's when we experience deep heartbreak. And the heartbreak is what feels like broken. That's the brokenness of like, oh, I'm heartbroken, deeply heartbroken because I love this person so much and they're gone. And so grief is the natural response to heartbreak, which is often what we're shoving down, right? And so because we feel bad and we want to feel good again or we want it to go away. And so I find what's actually most helpful is like learning to love our grief because it's our love, similar to how the body loves us. Like the body is the one thing that I go back to of unconditional love. Like it loves us so much it'll let us kill us. It'll let us kill it. It loves us to eternity. And so how do we learn to lean into that heartbreak or that brokenness with this deep love and acceptance of like, okay, this is my heart. The reason this hurts or I'm in pain or I'm in grief is because I love so deeply. And so it's learning to deeply accept the heartbreak and almost look at it as sacred. Um, and what I find is that it's almost like it's the counterintuitive. Instead of going, this is going to go away soon, or you're just going to move through this, or give it time, or all these things are a fix. It's almost like, can I accept that this may always be here? Because there's a part of me that loved my brother so deeply that I feel deeply heartbroken. And it's almost in the acceptance of allowing that to be there. I almost find it allows our heart to grow around it. So it's almost like the heartbreak's still there, but then our love grows stronger around it and we have more love in our hearts. And I find each time we allow ourselves to be like a lot of the work of grief is being really gentle, really loving with ourselves, really compassionate. And so the more compassionate we can be with our heartbreak, the more compassionate we can be with our journey, the more compassionate it puts us into the world, where we're like, oh, I can be there with me, so I can be there with you when you're grieving. I can be there with you in the depths of your pain because I can be there with me in the depths of my pain without a fix. Because oftentimes what we need most when we're in grief is we just need people there with us. Like, I don't want to be alone in this. Can you just be here with me for a minute in my grief? Can you be with me in my sadness for a minute in my grief? Right? Can you be here with me? And so that's what I find a lot of the work of deep grief is, it's learning to be with our grief without a fix. And that's where some of the practices are helpful of like, how can I be with that? Because it's hard. It's really hard. It's really painful. It's really messy. And most of society says we're not supposed to be there, and most people run from it. So that's what's confusing. It's not like, ah, you're in pain. Let me come over and hang out. Let's have a meal together. Or what do you want to share? What's on your heart right now? Right? Most people are like, oh, a little uncomfortable. I'll see you later. And so we just don't have a lot of awareness around it. That's why I'd love more grief-informed world where we learn to just be there, because that's what we need most. It's like, ah, can you just be here with me? So I don't think it goes away necessarily, but I feel like over time, because our heart grows, the pain is not so excruciating. And I feel like initially it takes up our emotional capacity. This is another way to kind of look at it is, think of, I use it in a metaphor of like, imagine we have a basket and this is our emotional capacity. And our emotional capacity is how much can I take on emotionally in life? I got, you have wife, kiddos, grandchildren, business, all these different, your health, you have your travel schedule. So you have all these different things that take up rocks in the bucket. And so oftentimes when our emotional bandwidth, when grief happens or a death happens, it like, and we don't have a lot of bandwidth, it all of a sudden drops our bandwidth to very low. Like if you're normally 100% during grief, let's say you get dropped down to like 25%, 30% emotional capacity. And so you're like, hey, I'm used to just handling this and running here, but you don't have the emotional capacity to do it. So
Right.
that's why we're often beating ourselves up. So the compassionate practices are like, ah, can I accept I'm at a much lower bandwidth? Can I build my life around that for a period of time so that I have more spaciousness? I'm not as hard on myself. And then eventually we get our capacity back. And so I feel like there's kind of two factors. There's the grief and the heartbreak, and there's also the emotional capacity, which I find that's what we tend to notice more day to day. Like, I'm not as quick, or I used to be moving much quicker, and why am I so slow or lethargic? And so I think it's building compassion for ourselves is a lot of times the way out of that.
Now, I before I met you, of course, I knew Jeffrey, and when I first met Jeffrey, I met your mother at the same time, and then subsequently your father. What always impressed me um, is the closeness that you all had as a family, and the ever present love. Jeffrey's passing was incredibly difficult on both of your parents. I would suggest probably more so on your mother. Um, your healing journey opened up an opportunity for them to really heal. I recall years ago after his passing, I stayed at your parents' home and I stayed in Jeffrey's room. And I watched this in the film that for however many years, the room had never been changed. Laundry baskets of clothes that were there before his passing were still there. And it was sort of this ever living shrine, as it were, particularly for your mother. It was very touching for me in the film to watch you all changing the room, painting it, getting rid of things and everything like that. Talk to us just a little bit. And your parents are some of the most beautiful people I have ever had the opportunity of meeting. Um, Talk to us a little bit about that aspect of helping your parents heal.
Yeah, one of the things I've learned about grief is 50% of families break up during grief, and I believe it's because of how we process grief very differently.
Right.
Um, my mom didn't want to touch my brother's room and just needed to leave it untouched and almost wanted to live in the past, was her part of her healing journey. Versus my dad is actually very opposite. He just wanted to move forward. He didn't want to look at it again. And I think through how we all dealt with it, we ended up coming together, which is oftentimes rare. Usually people fall apart, and just gave each other space. So I think my dad actually played video games a lot of the time. Was like, you go do your thing. I'm just going to emote myself in this alternative world for a while, which was a number of years, until he came out of some of his. And I know she went into just reliving in his room. She slept in his room. I think the first year she wailed almost every night. And one of the big things that was most helpful for us was we did a lot of psychic readings. And one of my good friends, Sonny Don Johnson, who's become a mentor and a good friend, um, we were so focused in like the loss of his absence that we were kind of like in the pain of it. And then she introduced these concepts of looking for his presence and looking for signs and looking for things that he was still here. And that became, I think, really helpful for all of us because my dad's parents died when he was very young. So he's just like, you die and you move forward. So I don't want to talk about it again. And so when we started doing those sessions, we all started to ask, hey, show us a sign, give us the signal. Are you still here? And you know my brother well, he's super witty, playful character, like and so that's how he would come through. He would come through playing jokes, playing tricks on us, doing silly things that was like his character. And so then it became this thing where we started to like look for the signs, and we started to share like my mom would get these like, oh, these she gets something on her back and she would almost get this jolt of electricity and like, oh, I know that's Jeffrey. Or she would see reoccurring numbers on vehicles and license plates, and her lights every time you go on this family trip every year, the lights would go on and off right before the family trip. Like literally the day before we were leaving, they'd walk outside, and it happened for years. Like every time the day before we would go, the lights would flicker. They even changed a vehicle and got a new vehicle, and the new vehicle was changing lights. Like it was really cool outside the box stuff. And my dad was a jokester where he'd always like kind of, we'd be hunting or fishing and he'd kind of use a twig and kind of get you behind your ear and you're thinking it's a bug. And then you turn around and he's laughing. And he said for years now, every time he's out fishing or hunting, he starts going like this and he looks around, and it's my brother. And so I think there was so many little experiences like that that we started to celebrate and talk about. And I think that became the mission. We even dedicated a camp to Jeffrey from the, called the Wanderers Camp at Burning Man. And so I think we used his presence as kind of a coping mechanism for us to like celebrate his life and come together and mourn him. Like it was an active process of mourning, but doing it in a more sacred way, which was super healing. And then um, I think my mom, she didn't touch his room for a decade, and then at a decade, I actually flew back and she went through the dirty clothes, and that was a previous scene we ended up cutting out because it looked too similar. Some of the feedback we had of like the room and that, but I initially had a whole scene of her just going through the dirty clothes, which was beautiful, and there still was his scent on the clothes because it literally had been untouched in the hampers. And I thought that was it. Like, okay, she's made that. And then a couple years later, she's like, I think I'm ready to go through the room. And it was like amazing. And so I felt that was a really big turning point of like, going through the room, getting rid of things, repainting the room. I actually moved in for a year after that, which is a whole nother journey of like, I was doing a lot of my own deep work around boundaries and relationship and was like, everything comes from home. How do I move into that? And it was during COVID when I actually wanted to like, everything was shut down anyway. And I'm like, I might as well be with family and learn a little bit more. But I moved into the room for a year. So it was kind of like a shifting of the torch, changing of the energy. Um, and very healing, I think, for the family unit. And a part of the reason I wanted to share that is somebody may have been 1 years in, 3 years in, 5 years in, 7 years in, 8 years in of a similar process as my mom. And a lot of people are like, you need to get over this. And worse is it just, if when we're ready, life takes into the next season. And I think we all kind of started to have it around the same time. The room happened with my mom and I believe 22. She was ready to go through the room. No, 2020. So she was ready to go through the room in 2020. We shut down the Wonders Camp in 22, which was kind of like my dad got a little bit tired. I was going to take it over. And then it was like, I think this is complete now. And we just retired the camp and passed the torch on to somebody else. And then I did my forgiveness ceremony in 2022, which was kind of my shift. And even finishing the film was a big part of my completion of like, can I get this into the world and stop filming, stop shooting, and just like this is in the world. So we all, within like a 2 year period, I think, actually two to, I just put the film out, 4 year period had completion of like, okay. And when I say completion, I mean, it's still a little tough in the holidays for me now, right? I noticed around Thanksgiving, my brother's birthday is December 6th. He died the 28th. Like, I just noticed I still was a little like gunky. And so I don't think it's necessarily gone away, but it's not as intense as it was in the beginning, where it was like all consuming, total shutdown, total grief, stricken. Now it's a little bit more like, oh, there's a moments of grief, and I've learned to just go, ah, okay, that's what this is. Let me be gentle. This is here again. Um, and then to really move back into the parts that I can be grateful for is the primary.
Now, the film spans many years, and so were you actively, consciously working on a film, or uh, was that the plan? Because I mean, it's how many years does you've got the how many years does the film actually span?
But film fans a decade. The film spanned a decade. And initially set out to shoot a film with my buddy Chris Hillman, who's in the film shooting me, and you get to see him in the film. And we had a really interesting connect because I lost my younger brother Jeffrey on December 6th. He lost to a heroin overdose. He lost his older brother Ricky to a heroin overdose on December 13th. And then Chris and I are a day apart. So he was kind of like the younger brother. I was the older brother. So we had these really interesting, or no, Ricky's birthday was December 13th. Jeffrey's was December 6th. So there's all these similar parallels. And we set off to, in our both of our grief, to understand more about it. We filmed from 2014 through 2018. My journey was more doing interviews with experts, doing the men's retreat work, a lot of the footage you see in the film. His journey was going to do ayahuasca ceremonies. He went and did a Pachacama cleanse in India. Like, he was doing more global, experiences with his body. And then we initially actually did a finished cut in 2018 where we wove the stories together and had a finished cut. And then we got feedback on it, and it was like two huge stories that we tried to mix in together. And we realized we couldn't finish it that way. We both almost needed to tell our own story. So then it was a whole nother year process of untangling the film, which it's so emotionally tied, and there's all this money involved and time and energy. And so somehow, by the grace of God, we ended up doing that in a really loving way and ended up like really close after that. And so that was in 2018. I took a year or two off, and then in 2020, did additional filming, and that's where the room, so it kept evolving, and I would just keep filming as it kept evolving. And then I finally, actually, when I got the EIDL loan, probably not the best choice of funds, but I was like, I just need to get this finished. I used that when the economy took a downturn, part of that because I'd already been filming and it qualified as part of my business funds to just get it finished. I was like, I need to get this off my plate. This is an open-ended big window that's just sitting here continually running. And so I made the decision to hire another production team to take 14 terabytes of footage, and turn that into what's now a 60-minute film, which it took us another year. So I think I hired them in about January of 24, and we finished it right, or no, excuse me, I finished that in of 23. So January of 23 to right about December of 23, I finished it right at the end of last year. And then this year was like, I was initially going to put on the shelf, like finish the film. A launch is a whole different story. So let me just put it on the shelf. And then I think a couple months in, I got the inspiration, like, you know what? I want to put this into the world on his birthday and just have this into the world and not be attached to how big of a launch it is or how big I do it. It's just more like, this art's in the world now. And so I did 7 film festivals, won awards at 4, and then we did a premiere and I did an online launch. So it's a big feat getting the film done, but it spanned over a decade of filming. And what's hard about that is most often they start documentaries with an actual script or kind of a narrative of what they're going to do. I didn't. So I had to go back through the footage and turn it into a narrative. And so I used a lot of narration. um, at one point, I finished a first cut, and one of my buddies is Adrian Grenier, and he was an actor in Entourage. And he looked at it and he's like, "Oh no, you got to change the whole thing." And so I had to rechange. He's like, "There's no story here," because I had included my mom's story in my, like, I did it more at how the actual time progressed. And he helped me rechange the format so that you kind of see one hero's journey. I was trying to give him everything I'd learned up front, and he's like, "You're kind of robbing us of the experience." So like, rebuild it out how you went through the journey, and then there's that turning point where we come back home again. That was initially up front, which kind of he's like, that's the juice. Like save that to the end where you're waiting to get it, and then eventually you get what you're actually wanting. So once that came back together, it was like, even though the timelines are sometimes a little hard to follow in it because you go back to 2014 after you've been to 2022. I think the storyline worked, and I just let go of the rest and said, okay, this feels good. But I mean, it's a crazy journey. I think I have like six of these big G drives because I had backups of them and multiple iterations of them, and it's a crazy work. I had want to say 13 interviews that I did, and then realizing the story format, I had to cut all those down to I think seven and like 1 point, even though I had so much of a story, like I just had to pick 1 point that's the main narrative to use from everybody. So it was a definitely a journey to go through. Definitely a journey.
Well, it's really an amazing film that if I didn't know you and your family and Jeffrey, I would still feel that same way about it. I watched it in Mexico when it came out. I happened to be down there, and just really, really, it touched me on a very deep level. Before we move on to some other things, how do people watch it now? How do they get to it?
Yeah, if they just go to giftofgrieffilm.com, they can watch it. It's available for online streaming. So they can go to giftofgrieffilm.com.
Okay, excellent. Um, So the work that you've done, the I got to see a lot of that in the film, and you can literally feel the impact that these processes and these experiences that you facilitate and that you've trained people in, you can feel that. Talk to us a little bit about that and what you do with the first responders, and where does it all go from here?
Yes, so I started more doing like deep somatic hands-on work, which is essentially what we're doing is we're putting hands on the body. So if somebody's saying, "Hey, where do you feel pressure?" We're going somatically to say, "Where do you feel pressure on the body?" Somebody might say, "My chest," and then I'll have a guy put hands on the chest. Or this could work with women too. And then it sometimes moves, like, "Oh, I feel it in my forehead." So somebody would put pressure on the forehead or my shoulders or my legs. So oftentimes you got maybe pressure on the chest and moves to the legs. Somebody puts pressure on the legs, moves to the head, pressure on the head, and all of a sudden somebody will get neutral. Once they get neutral, that was the kind of the body holding the grief. And when we remove the pressure from it and it creates this neutral state, then you're able to just say, "Hey, who's heavy on your heart?" And then somebody would bring into the space whoever's like at the top of that kind of center column of grief. This person's heavy on my heart. And we would do practices of calling them into the space and then expressing what hadn't been expressed. And oftentimes that's where deep grief bubbles out. Anger oftentimes can bubble out, or grief and anger, sadness. And so we would offload that. And there's different kind of strategies to move the body, getting picked up, pushed on the ground, breaking free. Like it's kind of different practices on what each man or woman needs. And then there's almost like when we feel it, because we got to feel it to heal it, and that's often been unfelt or unexpressed, there's this almost deep access to the heart. And from that place, we can feel like this universal truth. And then often we're filling it back up again with like, okay, well, what's the truth now? And it's like, they did the best they could with the tools they had, or they deeply loved me and didn't have any tools to help me, and they were in their own pain, or whatever they truth, they can feel the more duality of the situation. So I did that for a long time. That led to doing suicide prevention programs. And then what interesting happened is even in my own grief, I would clear a lot and be like, something's still here, something's still here. And it led me from grief into the nervous system. And the nervous system is really kind of combined with trauma, but it's really how often our bodies are in survival states. So a lot of my work started in grief, moved into nervous system work, because if we can regulate our nervous systems every day, we're essentially dealing with stress and being able to move out of back of the brain work, which is survival based reactions to keep us safe, and move to the front of the brain, which is that emotional regulated place, which essentially we're working with the longest nerve in the body, which puts us into a parasympathetic state versus a sympathetic state, which essentially is activated versus regulated. So when we're activated, we're usually quick in emotional reaction, whether it be anger, frustration, sadness, or disconnect. Like, I just got to get out of here. Or we can be feeling anxiety or depression or just addictions. A lot of things surface when we're in constant states of high survival. The body is trying to survive that by keeping our nervous system in a fight or flight response. And so when we can shift that into a regulated response, that gets us back to baseline and then starting to feel what comes up underneath. And so that's the primary work I do with first responders is they deal with the average individual has three major traumatic events in their life, where the average 30-year first responder has 300. And so they're dealing with a lot more of that. So they're living primarily in survival states. So learning the tools to regulate their nervous system and identify what I call trauma signs are like the gauges on the truck. So if you're driving down the road and the gauge pops up, it says warning signal, you're low on gas, or warning signal, engine oil lights on, you know how to repair and maintain your vehicle, which is the same for us. So I do a lot of training on becoming highly aware of the nervous system, how to identify those signals, what to do to get regulated and get back in your body again, and then how to communicate that to the family. Because most often we all have trauma in our family units, and the way we try to protect our family is by avoiding or hiding or conflict, fight or flight again. And so when we don't know that stems from a traumatic incident, there's the blowback in the family, and that's what leads to all the suicidal problems because suicide's now the number two cause of death for both fire and police. It's over line of duty death. So you're more likely to die from suicide than running into a burning house or some of the severity of the jobs they deal with. And so that's to combat that. So we have programs where we do train the trainer, where we recorded curriculum, we train trainers, and then they play it for their fire or police station to get the training over 10 months and so that they have the tools repped. Um, and and then again, it's the same thing. If I take that to men in relationships or women in relationships, which is now kind of the area I'm working in now, most of the challenges we have in relationship are because we're in a fight or flight state with our nervous system, or past grief or trauma is getting triggered that we're reacting to, and then we're in conflict in our relationship. So if we can learn to regulate our nervous system, if we can learn to both take ownership for our own past grief and trauma, what it does is we get access to our heart, and when we have access to our heart, we can see each other clearly. We can communicate with love. We can see each other when we're dysregulated, which is a big part of it. And for those women, let's say, that are dating, they can also start to identify unhealthy patterns of like, oh, this is a red flag, believe it. Or this is the difference of somebody who's done the work or hasn't done the work. And in women in relationships, there's a lot of just masculine, feminine dynamics. So working with men for a decade, we're very different species than women. And so I find once they learn that we want to serve them and we love to serve, and our goal is to be the king, like, hey, I just want to serve you, make your life happy, but we're wired very differently than women. So when they can learn how to communicate through the way we see the world, they get what they want. And so oftentimes it's a lot harder as a man because with men, the way our brains are wired, it takes us more time to get into our heart and our emotions, whereas women can go back and forth very quickly. And so when they learn how we're wired and they learn how to communicate in that way and learn that we want to serve them and we're doing the best we can and how to communicate through that and see through that lens, I find it turns around relationships because now they're actually more emotionally aware and attuned. So when they learn the tools, it's like oftentimes women are like, can he slow down sexually for me? I just want him to slow down a little bit more. And it's the same thing we need with our hearts. And so when they learn, oh, I just got to slow down, I got to ask questions, I got to go a little bit deeper, I have to learn how to see and appreciate what he's doing in the world and how he shows up in the world. It changes dynamics and especially when we learn how to communicate from the heart. So that's why it's my deepest mission now is if we can heal the relationship with our hearts, then we can heal relationships in our relationships. Then we start to heal the family unit. And I truly believe if we can heal the family unit, that's what changes the trajectory in the world from creating more trauma or more pain in the world.
Oh, that's amazing. And actively doing retreats, plans for 2025?
Yep. I'm going to be doing a couple women's retreats this year. I actually stopped some of the men's work for a little bit, and we'll probably reactivate that at the end of the year or in early 2026. I did it for a decade and needed to reset for a little while. So we turned it into a member-led community. That was called K4 Men, but we'll probably reactivate that in either late 25 or 26. And so in 25, I'm going to be doing a couple women's retreats where we go deeper into learning relationship dynamics, nervous system dynamics, and so I'll be having a couple retreats coming up for women, which is fun.
That's great. Now, you've always been in good shape, but your body, you seem to really get um, more of a transformation in your body in the last few years. Want to talk to us about that a little bit?
Yeah, I did. I started just focus. Actually, I went through kind of a reset when COVID happened and had to go through a big shift because I was doing all in-person events and I had to turn everything online. And during that transition phase, actually, when I moved back with my parents, I was like, I'm just going to be here while I rebuild this. I just really started focusing on the training and was like, all right, let me just do this slow, not fast and quick, but like, let me slowly rebuild my body. So I started hiring a trainer that was rebuilding small muscle groups and started to learn how my body had been overcompensating in certain areas and how I was just trying to push through, kind of same metaphor as my life. I was just trying to push through. And I just started to take like a longevity approach to training, like, oh, how do I start to rebuild my body so its structure is built correctly? If there's an injury, how do I address the injuries? Learn to stretch, learn to add a lot more build up time where I'm like stretching and warming up, stretching and winding down. And when I did that for about 6 months, started to have more consistent food. Then I started to actually track my food, and I'd never tracked macros or anything around it. So the combination of the two really led to a really big transformation. And my coach at the time, because I'd hired a nutrition coach, was like, hey, why don't you do a show? And so I did a bodybuilding show and I was like, oh, I'll just try to do it. And it was amazing. It was an amazing experience. Where I went wrong, because I made some mistakes after that, is I was like in the prime shape of my life. And I was like, oh, I want to go pro. I kept wanting to go to the next level. So I hired another coach and the diet training that he had me on, the schedule that he had me training on, he had me double my intake of food to try to put on like another 25 pounds of muscle mass. And it just tried to do it too quickly. And actually, I had insulin spikes and some hormonal changes and even got a little pre-diabetic. So I had to basically stop all that. I just took a year and a half to recover. And now I'm just getting back in the from just a more longevity mode. So now my mindset is more, what can I do for the rest of my life? I do like the tracking. Some people it doesn't work for at all, but at least for me, I undereat. So the big awareness for me is like when I get busy, I eat like a couple meals a day and then I eat too much fat, not enough protein. And then what happens is I start gaining weight because my body's retaining water and it's also stacking on fat because the body's amazing. Like, we're not getting food. Let me store energy reserves because I don't know when we're going to eat again. And then my mind sees it as me getting fat. And so I eat even less and it creates this unhealthy pattern. So for me, what's helpful about the macros is I can track the ratio of foods and I can know I'm getting enough calories and also prioritizing protein and reducing fat because otherwise I unconsciously almost eat a little bit too much fat and way under protein and way under calories. And so yeah, that's where I'm at now is just rebuilding, living longevity and really just retaining enough muscle mass because most of the injuries they show later in life, most of the death is actually related to like we don't carry enough muscle and then we have a break of a bone and then our body falls apart because of that like knee replacement or something that needs to get done. So all the longevity research now shows to can I just retain enough muscle mass and what they call VO2 max, which is just enough oxygen running through my body. So I have enough energy so that when I'm 44 now, when I'm 64, 74, 84, 94, what's my life there? So I'm really kind of taking a different approach and saying, how can I do live now? So then I'm living a really good life with lots of energy and vitality. So I'm shifting gears.
I love the way you've share about your life and the different aspects of your life and how you have allowed yourself to see the truths and the realities, from be it how your body works to how your mind works, how your emotional body works. I find that to be very, very inspiring.
Hmm.
Now, other films in the works. I know that this was probably need a reset from this one, but are you thinking that you might enter into that foray a little bit more?
I may in the future, but if I did, I would do it differently. I would actually have a clear story, a clear agenda. I would save a lot of time, a lot of money, and I'd know what I'm wanting to shoot. So if I did it again, I wouldn't just be like in discovery for a long period of time. I'd have a clear agenda, a clear storyline, and be like mapping something out so I could get it done in a reasonable time frame. So I've thought about doing stuff. I mean, I like shedding light on problems that society needs to know about and finding creative ways to do that as a form of art. If I were, I would either do it on, men's work, masculinity, relationships, just because I'm super passionate about it now, or even deeper down the first responder. So I think those would be some of the areas, maybe first responder first, just because I know that really well. But I'm really loving the relationship dynamics, and I think I'm just learning so many people have challenges with theirs. So the more creative ways we can get inspired, I think film and media can be an interesting way to do that. So maybe to come in the future, but not at this point. I'm just taking a little break and enjoying the have that window closed.
Right. But we'll keep watching. Now, here we are, January 1st. A lot of people getting focused on how to make the most of this year, and making resolutions and this, that, and the other. Any particular insights or anything you want to share related to that?
Yeah, I've done both the process where I do an end of year review every year, where it's which if they even if they're January 1st, it may still be helpful of just looking at last year. Take a couple hours and just look at the previous year. I find it can also be really helpful. Like if you journal, you can go back through your journals. If you don't, just look at your photos. Like oftentimes we're moving through the world so fast and we never take time to go back and review. So I find just take a couple days if you haven't done it and like look at your year through your photos and just kind of look through the year and say, hey, what were amazing moments? What can I really celebrate myself? What am I most proud of? What can I see as a trend? I know when I've done it, I'm like, every time there's a down, there's an up again. So when I know when I'm in a contracted state, at some point I'm going to be back up again. And it just helps remind me that it's life's like this. And so to continually be reminded. And then I always like to do what would last year's chapter be? And so I could give it like a chapter of a book. If I was writing a book, what would each chapter be? And then what do I want this year's chapter be? So for me, that gives me a really clear kind of, I call it a kingdom goal when I've done a lot of men's work. Like, what's my primary kingdom goal for the year? And then oftentimes I set in four other buckets that I do quarterly. But so for me, the kingdom goal is containment this year. Like, what does it look like to really be super clear with my energy, very contained with my energy, and like really learning to find joy in the boring or the monotonous moments of life. So how do I bring more aliveness, more joy? So if I'm containing my energy, I'm not looking for the big trip or the big exploration or the big thing. I'm actually looking for stability and just really consistency and finding a lot like how do I really look for how do I make this moment amazing, right? And if it's just the boring moment, I think that's the way I'm wanting to like at least this year. That's the energy of this year. So what would that be for somebody listening? Like if you really thought about what do you need right now? What would make this year the most amazing year for you? I like to look in four buckets. I do them around the masculine archetypes of king, lover, warrior, magician. But king is more of like, oh, do I need more play? So it could be like a more embodied state. Do I need to play more this year? Would that bring me more aliveness? Or do I need to really focus on my career? Would that bring me like, do I have a big vision that I want to accomplish? Um, is there in my lover house could be relationships? Is there a certain relationship like I really need to focus on my marriage or what about my relationship with myself? Or um, maybe it's even like really deep self-care practices. Like, what would it look like if I really made the year really focused on resiliency or self-care practices? When I move into the magician, do you have a book that's in you that you've really been putting off? But if you just focus this year on little bits on a regular basis, and at the end of the year, you had a book in the world or a film or like a project you want to birth, or it could be a system. Like if you really wanted to focus on your money or your savings or your investing or a certain area that would require a plan, a process, what would that look like? And then lastly, in the warrior house is like your health and your fitness. So it's like, hey, do I really want to focus, or boundaries? Do I really want to set some boundaries this year and really put some strong boundaries? Or if I just made my fitness or my diet or my workout routine the focus of the year, what would that look like? So just given a couple different buckets for to choose from. And then I'd say out of those, choose one primary goal for the year, or a kingdom goal to say, if I just focus on this, and then I have a couple buckets in each of those each quarter that I rotate. That's how I look at the year, because what it does is I know my overarching goal for the year of that, who I'm going to be by doing that. And then each quarter I go, okay, let me reassess. What do I need a little bit more of this quarter? And then the big thing with goal setting is start slow. Most people go so quick and then they fizzle out. I think they say all people stop working out on like the 13th of January. Like they don't even make it past the first 13 days.
Right.
And I think it is because the first week you see everybody at the gym going too hard. So what I've learned is go slow and consistent at first, and then just keep stacking as you get better at it. It's more important to do the thing than how good you do it. So even my first week back at the gym, I'm always like, just get there. I could be there 15 minutes. I'm like, I got there again. I got there again. And then the next week, can I stay for an extra 10 or an extra 20? And if you make that consistency the goal versus how good you do, um, that starts to build momentum, and then momentum starts to build happiness. And at the end of the quarter, I don't measure the goals, I measure the progress. So just a couple things on when you're starting up the year. If you lay out goals, what are the action steps you need to do each day to move you towards those, and just celebrate the progress you're making. And it's more about progress because that builds momentum and you feel happy and fulfilled, like I'm making progress. Then it's never about reaching the outcomes, it's about who you become in the journey towards those outcomes.
Wow. Thank you so much. I even before watching the film recently, you've been an inspiration
Mm.
for me in my life, and I've valued our friendship. I appreciate you taking the time to be on the It's All Good show and to share and to help us welcome the new year. So thank you very much, Joshua. Happy New Year to you, and as always, wishing you the very best.
Hey, thanks so much, Dr. Dream. It's such a pleasure to jump back on and catch up with you. I have so much respect for you and the work you're doing in the world and your heart. You've always had just such the biggest heart. And I've always felt so inspired and just loved by you. And so I'm just so grateful for you, brother, and so great to be celebrating this new year with you.
Thank you. And Happy New Year to the It's All Good show family. We appreciate you, and we'll be with you all year, helping love and support you. Thank you all very much. Bye, Joshua.
Bye-bye.